Good evening. Call the order of the Planning Commission regular meeting for May 15th, 2025. We'll ask the clerk to call roll, please.
Here.
Here. Here.
Here.
Here.
Mayor.
He's missing. Here. Fantastic. Welcome, everyone. After not having a meeting last month, everybody enjoyed their break. I miss seeing everyone, so I'm happy to see you here tonight. The agenda is before everyone. It was also in our kit. Is there any changes or additions to the agenda? If not, we'll have a motion to approve.
So move.
Support. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Seeing none. Agenda's approved. In our packets was the minutes from our March 2025 meeting. I had an opportunity to read through. I didn't see anything. Did anyone else see anything that needed to be updated or changed? Seeing none.
Motion to approve the minutes for March 20th meeting.
Second.
All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
What's that?
Go.
Which then moves us to our first public comment section. If you would like to make a public comment regarding items that are on the agenda for this evening, if you're in the room, you can come up to the microphone. If you're online, you just need to raise your hand or notify us in some way. State your name, your address, and then what agenda item you would be speaking to, and limit your comments to 3 minutes. Having no one in the room, I don't see a hand up online. Then we will close out the public comment section on agenda items. We did not have anything underneath old business at this time, which will then move us on to the new business. The first item for discussion was the master plan discussion. Luke or Dave, you want to kind of?
Yeah, I'll sort of introduce us here. Obviously, we've been talking about the idea of a tri-community master plan with Douglas and the township for some time. And there definitely was some initial support, but it looks like at this time, neither are able to move forward with a joint effort. That's not to say there might not be a chance down the line to coordinate some kind of future land use map together or some kind of shared chapter. But at this point, we need to focus on doing a city-focused master plan. So not to say that a formal partnership is required. Obviously, we can make sure that our goals align when it makes sense, or we can still have collaboration with them on this effort. But at this point, we're going to move forward with a city-only master plan. So one thing we need to think about is obviously public input, how much and how we go about gathering that. Obviously, summer is nearly here. It's very busy. Plenty of residents in town, business owners and visitors, of course. And so things like a community survey or an open house or pop-up events would all help us gather that kind of information. So the goal tonight is to get your thoughts on a direction for us so we can begin shaping the scope and the budget for the master plan. And we have Dave here in person, which is always nice, who can help guide us through this process.
Fantastic. Dave, do you have anything you want to add right now?
Nothing much more than that, except for I think tonight would be helpful if we could get some guidance on how we want to move with the various opportunities. As Luke mentioned, a community survey, a pop-up table station that could be kind of mobile to various events throughout the summer, as well as we could do one or more open house events here at City Hall. So if you were open to all three of those opportunities, I'd suggest that we put together a draft survey for review at the next meeting. For the stations and the open house, I can also put together a framework and show how that might work and give some ideas about different boards and stations at those types of events.
Right.
So I think those three would probably be pretty comprehensive. It'd be a good way for us to really kick off the master plan without doing the actual master planning work. I think we could take the summer to get input, community involvement, do a little bit of education. And then once we receive all the input, then we get into the planning process here as a group to work through focus areas of the plan and goals, objectives, future land use, that. But I think our immediate priority should be community input, hit the tourist season and the summer season, as Luke said. And if you're open to it, we could put together draft materials and ideas for those three types of events. If you have any other ideas, be happy to hear those as well.
I have a question of how the two of you, for example, are viewing this. Are you viewing it as a revision and update of our portion of the tri-community master plan? Or are we starting from square one, creating our own? How are you two thinking about it so far?
Well, in my opinion, I think it's starting as a new master plan. I think there's a lot of information that could be taken from the tri-communities plan and carried over, but I think a new plan could be something that's very obviously city specific. I think it needs to be short and concise and user friendly and clear. I think the themes and background information can be taken from the old plan, but I think a lot of it's going to be new. It's going to be I wouldn't say it's a complete rewrite, but I think it would be pretty close in my opinion. But with that though, I mean, as I said, we could carry over a lot of information from the tri-communities plan. And it might also be worth an exercise just as a group here to just do a formal review and to talk about the sections of the plan, talk about which sections are still applicable, where we need work. And I think that would be helpful for really the scoping process as well. So maybe the summer months is public input, education outreach, as well as us deciding the extent of the changes in the direction of the planning process after community involvement. So we may page through the plan, work together, look at chapter by chapter and say, hey, these are still very important aspects that we need to retain in the new plan. Here are other elements that are no longer applicable or no longer reflect the perspectives of the community. So I think maybe that formal review process could happen at some point during the summer.
And my other point real quick is my experience in even talking about what we were going to have on the agenda tonight, people give a blank look when you say master plan.
Correct.
They have no freaking clue what you're talking about. So I anticipate from what you're talking about, both in terms of a survey and public outreach, would be some kind of directed avenue for input versus what do you think about a new master plan? I mean, or what do you think should be in our master plan? I mean, I think you're going to, I don't think that will be fruitful. So anyway,
And I have to agree that many people don't even know what the master plan is.
or that they exist.
Right. And then who will do all the demographic work? Do we hire someone?
That's something that we can certainly do.
I mean, because when I look through, like, the previous one, we kind of start off with kind of like the area wide kind of policy. And then you look through what your kind of goals are. Then the second whole part was like demographics, which they pull all this stuff together. And as you kind of move forward, so I'm assuming that there's like a third party that gets hired. Is it like a McKenna type of group or not? Or is that something that you pull together?
Well, I think that's something for us to discuss at some point. The plan itself in the scope budget, who's going to be involved, who's on our team. But I mean, the background data, the demographics, that's all available through the American Community Survey census data. That's all fairly straightforward to pull those numbers and find the trends. And I think a lot of that base information that the early chapters of the plan, however we structure it,
Right.
we'd have a kind of an city at a glance, or here's the inventory of resources, community facilities, the people, demographics, and so that's kind of sets the stage for the recommendations later on. So we do an inventory analysis, needs assessment, demographics, and then we would likely have chapters on our different topic areas of the plan. Again, I haven't even put my thoughts into how we would structure it yet, but
Only because
have them together.
when I heard about it being city only, it made me think that when we first start talking about whether it's a city at a glance, or if I'm looking at demographics, I can talk with the city of Saugatuck, but I still need to bring in the entire region because we draw from the entire region, whether we're doing a tri-community plan, but we need to understand the overall size of our kind of what I'd kind of call the business district of the tri-community and how many people. So some of the stuff I still think is going to be necessary to kind of be able to identify, what is in Township, what is in Douglas, what is in Finnville, the places that we really see are contributing towards our business and our tourism, since that's really our driving engine. Now, but there are a number of things. I do agree with you. I think the first thing we'd have to do in one of the future meetings is kind of go through the existing plan. because there's sections in here that no longer will relate to the city of Sagatuck, because there's many things in here that talk about land development and interchanges and which again affect the city, but they're not in the city of Sagatuck. So we have to kind of determine, how, what scope we'd want to use moving forward, because again, I don't want to try to create something starting at ground zero since we've already got a very good document that was created 10 years ago. That's my thoughts anyway.
So sort of create a reasonable or summarize what's existing and see what is working and what isn't.
Like if we're going through and we say, okay, I think, yeah, the small town character that's, listed as one of our top priorities, fantastic. We'd want to keep it. Land use and community facilities. Yes, we'd have to break it down to just ours. Of course, like land use for the city of Sagatuck, we're pretty much developed. So there's not a lot of, things we can talk about as far as for open land. But I would think that as we kind of go through here, we can kind of identify, what we like, and then if there's sections that we'd want to add in.
And just, I think that's sort of homework. I think what I want to do is I want to go through it and I want to offer back to David, here's what I think should come forward. And I may even from that come up with some good, of the survey questions that might make sense just to add to some data for you, or some things that I find interesting. So.
Because I do think you have to kind of go through it before you can create the survey, just to kind of think about the parts of it. Bobby, I know you've been through it before, so what are your thoughts?
Well,
Besides being disappointed that it's not a tri-community.
it's, no, I think considering that I think I'm the only one here that has been through a tri-community plan.
Right.
I think that we need to get grounded in terms of what the work is we're supposed to do. And the past 20 years have been a tri-community plan. So this will be very different.
Very much.
And I'm what you just raised is one of the reasons that I'm concerned that we're not thinking about this as a tri-community, because boundaries in this particular case are really artificial constructs.
Exactly.
And I am at a loss to understand why that type of thinking is not shared among us. But at any rate, I think that we all need to get familiar with what the planning requirements are and do our best in terms of developing a plan for the city of Sagatuck. But I also think that if I understand it correctly, the city of the village of Douglas has completed their plan.
That's what I was going to ask. I have not seen it. Has anyone seen that
Correct.
yet?
That's correct.
And so I think we need to understand that plan. And I don't know where the township is at. You, David?
I think they're going to be working on an amendment to the plan in the
Correct. So, yeah,
upcoming
a
year.
review is upcoming of their plan, but they intend to move forward.
Okay,
their
but
own
they
website.
haven't completed or begun work on it.
They did a full review of the master plan, but three or 4 years ago.
Right.
And pull out about 70 to 80 action steps from the master plan, and then they implement those through their new zoning code update. So they did a lot of work on their review, on their zoning work, and I think at some point they're coming back to update the plan township specific as well.
Oh, we need to understand what the township is doing and what currently exists and the direction that they intend to proceed. And then we have to do our best in terms of developing a plan for the city of Sagatuck. But I would, again, I would ask, were there specific objections in terms of tri-community planning? Or was it, we just don't want to do it? I mean, were there objections, specific objections?
I think it's because Douglas
Yeah, Douglas.
prepared their own plans. They put in that time and effort. I
That's what they
think
said.
they're focusing their resources elsewhere since they just finished that.
Correct.
My understanding is that they, are now moving on to a rewrite they're looking at the zoning ordinance next. So that's where their resources are going. It's not, I don't think it's necessarily that they objected or they had previously moved, they had made the decision to move forward on their master plan before we sort of started taking these steps ourselves. So
Well, we talked about this the first year that I was on planning, and I think that was 2021 or 22.
Yeah.
And we talked about it as a tri-community, my understanding from the zoning administrator at the time. But nonetheless, it is what it is. So anyway, I think the plan is to get us up to speed in terms of what's on the books today, where Douglas and the township are at, and what the work plan is.
So
No.
as far as the, like, community pieces, I've talked to a few different people and I'm on board with them. I actually think they might be more receptive than it sounds to having us, that's something that's,
Right.
an addendum to the various companies. So I would suggest as we go through our plan and we see things that we can really belong in the tri-community document and kind of segregate that and package it. And probably it's gonna be a tough to lead that, so.
Right.
But I think if we want to be pushed, I don't think all of us, I guess is what I'm saying, so.
Well, it would be hard to know that based on what was described. So,
Yes.
yes, so thank you, Craig.
Right.
Right.
7 or 8 people.
Because definitely they felt that they had finished theirs. They said they'd be happy to review ours. They did suggest that we take a look at what they've done. Now, again, the only difference is if we were working together, we'd kind of collaborate on what it is. But now we're just reading theirs and either we agree or disagree with it, or we kind of incorporate, theirs along with it. But as far as sitting down, they didn't have an interest. So I agree. That's exactly the same things that I've heard is that they're open to, reviewing anything that we do or having their plan be part of ours in some way, but they're not looking at revising their plan.
Well, if we can demonstrate ourselves, collaborative behavior. And who knows, if something is discovered or learned or realized, that would benefit all of us, they
Right.
might be open-minded
Yeah,
to that.
yeah.
So I think that it's going to be up to us to model
Correct.
collaborative behavior.
I think that's a great point. We could have almost like a regional planning chapter or regional issue chapter within almost a template chapter that we can work on, and we could even have outreach with the other jurisdictions and collaborate with them, even though it's not, formal tri-communities process. So we can maintain that spirit, maybe have a template chapter that everybody could at some point adopt their own version of that type of template. I think throughout all of the chapters too, whether it's housing, transportation, environmental issues, water quality, we'll have topic areas that will all have regional objectives as well. So I think we're gonna, the whole plan, I think will tie together that regional planning effort as well. And I think we can make note of that as a priority in all of the topic area chapters.
And David, I would expect, I know that you continue to have a relationship with the township, I believe.
I no longer work with them. I did help with their
But
zoning
you-
code just on that. particular
Exactly.
project.
But you have a relationship with
Yes,
them.
Daniel and neighbor.
Exactly. How about Douglas?
I know they're consulting planners, so who put together their master plan, but
Okay.
I don't have any direct context there now.
So perhaps you can help us also with your insights
Sure.
and opportunities.
And what just think to look at it, when Douglas's plan it's a beautiful plan. And I've not done a content review on it and how they've incorporated the tri-communities plan, but I think my quick review of it, that is a good example of a very area specific plan. It's very graphic, very graphically friendly. It's great images. It's very user friendly, easy to read. I think that's a good example about how to put together a very good master plan. And it's clear to read objectives, goals, actions, future land use. They have a sub area plan in place. So I think as you all are reviewing the tri-communities plan, take a look at Douglas's. I think it's a good example about how to create a city specific plan.
Well, that's what I made note on was to review the Douglas one along with our own, because there's certain sections of the Douglas one, like when it's with the waterways, if we were to read what they've created and we agree with the priorities that they kind of set up, there's no reason for us to recreate that. You know, it's, because there's going to be certain things, especially when it comes to waterways, that I would think you either agree or disagree with your will.
Yeah, and I think the more commonality you can find, the more likely it is you can drive collaboration, potentially look at down the road, maybe merging into more of a fire tri-community plan.
Now, if we ended up-
It's an aspirational thing, but I think we should be going down that path.
If we move down the path of hiring an outside consultant to, help direct it and write it, would the same team that did the city of Douglas be a good idea, or is that more in your workshop?
That's a good conversation to have, and Luke and I have discussed that a bit. Williams and Works did assist Douglas. I
I know,
actually
I
did-
couldn't remember their name, but it was.
Yeah, and I actually chatted with one of the principals from Williams Works about possibly collaborating with us. I'm obviously a planner. I do master plans all the time, zoning
Okay.
work, but we have a lot on our plates.
Right, I was
this
gonna say,
year.
do you even
I'm
have
a
time?
One-person operation.
Right.
So, it would be, initial conversations, may something be interested in assisting with graphics and mapping and our public input effort. So I think that's something that Luke and I can come back with a proposal about how this is going to get accomplished. I think we can take those initial steps with public input and maybe even some of the initial reviews of the plans before we have to make that decision. So I
Okay.
think there's a lot of groundwork we can get done before we have to actually put a plan together. So
I think we have to review our existing and Douglas's first, before we could ever start talking about what we would want to have in a survey or what we would want to have at open houses or public forums.
And what's the best way for us to do that? If you have to markups and like, that's how my brain works. Like I get a document, I say, I
Right.
make comments and sort of hand it to you. You're gonna get that from a pile. So I think talking about it in a meeting like this doesn't capture the level of granularity we're gonna want for that. So just asking for your suggestion.
yeah, I think markups, summary, bold lists would be great. I think with the survey, it might be helpful if we took an initial, just get you kind of a general city plan survey and kind of get the basic questions. And then we're gonna, as you said, we're gonna have some more fine grained type questions that that are gonna be very specific to this community. So I think maybe if we could get you a framework and then you can think about those questions, look at the plans and then figure out how else do we want to supplement the survey to make it our own, to make it something that's gonna be valuable to this process. So, and maybe that's something to where we try to get you that a little bit earlier than our typical week ahead of time. If we could at least put together a framework so that you could be reviewing the plans, thinking about other questions, and then looking at a generalized kind of template survey, and then we can tune it up from there.
Could you give us a copy, or me at least, a copy of the Douglas plan?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
we could review, I'm sure they had a survey with their plan, so we can take a look at that survey, look at a couple other similar situated city plans in their survey, so just, and we pull together something that really suits our needs.
Now, this being the first time I've gone through the whole process with this, do a lot of the other communities, do they hold like a special meeting with the planning commission as opposed to trying to cover it in our normal regular meetings? Because it involves a lot of conversation. I could see myself, I'm thinking a special meeting that's just on the master plan where we'd come together and kind of, after you've given input, see where we have consistency and not try to do it at our monthly one. That's my thought. And I just want to know, has other cities done it that way?
It's with this type of scope that I'm envisioning, we're gonna need some special meetings for those public outreach sessions. So, yeah.
I'm talking about even for us to kind of like, before we even get to the public outreach, when we're getting ready to review Douglas's plan, our plan, surveys, ideas, instead of trying to jam it in the June meeting, should it be something that should have its own meeting? And then June is just on, the other planning issues.
That's a good point. I think some plan-specific meetings would probably be necessary.
I like it because I know like tonight I'm sitting there going, okay, how long are we going to stay on this topic? We got other things you got to get to versus if it's just that topic.
Right. I think that's a good idea.
Both head shaking.
Forward with that. Yep.
Now that I'm back for the summer, I don't mind calling one. I'll be honest. Then what, okay. So you'll get it. Yeah, now the one thing also, we have those surveys that we do at the start of the year, which kind of sets priorities for city council. I also think that we've got a lot of information when we were doing the waterfront preservation, because we talked a great deal about what people wanted to see, what they liked about the city and what they wanted to kind of see. So some of that data I think can also be incorporated. We got a lot of input during the short-term rentals, as far as how they want the neighborhoods to kind of feel. So I think we've got some data that we can already start to use, that we can even try to incorporate into the survey to make sure that we're still, capturing it. So.
Yeah, and I think, to Mark's earlier point, I think all of us, in terms of educating people, what is a master plan and why are we doing this? I think we can, at least if all of us can give a good elevator pitch on what it is and why we're doing it, and not overwhelm someone with, here's our, 10 chapter document that from the Tri-Communities plan. And we want to just tell people that this is a document that helps us to make decisions about land use and other priorities and public investment. And this shapes the future of our community. And we need your input and your priorities of what things that we need to study, things that we need to analyze, priorities that we need to include in the plan. And so I think if we just can get to that level during our conversations at pop-up events, at an open house events, people need to have just a general understanding of what we're doing and why, and then they just need to know, hey, my input is going to help this plan. And then we say, hey, keep in touch, stay informed. The information will be on the websites, and we're going to come back and show how this input was included in the plan at a later date. So we want folks to know that their input is going to count for something, and it will influence the goals, objectives, and actions of the plan. So reporting back in a way later in the summer or in the fall on how we're incorporating that input is going to be very important to those who were involved in the process.
I was looking at the City of the Village of Douglas website. They list their master plan as a draft. It has been adopted. It may just be a misstatement on their website, but when you go to master plan, it says draft.
I know it was presented at their meeting
I just,
ago, because they presented
just
it,
curious.
and I thought it was adopted by their council in February or March.
It could need, their website might need updating, that's all.
My understanding was that it was adopted.
Okay.
So I believe that the public hearing regarding it was back in February.
That was February.
Originally, yeah.
And I thought it was adopted by their council in March.
Okay.
I'll confirm that and get back.
Minor point, just curious.
Sure.
So knowing that our next meeting's in June, we want to try to have everybody review it and just give ideas the day by June and then call a special meeting after the June. Does that seem to be, or you would like to have one between now and June?
I
So-
think that's fine.
I was just going to say, I apologize. Obviously, a few years back, obviously Dave gave a presentation on the master plan. If you want, I could send out an email to you all with that presentation with our master plan, with Douglas's, with the Tri-Community master plan and with Douglas's. And maybe we can all individually review and
Yep.
bring back to that meeting and then make some further decisions in June if that
Perfect.
Yeah. seems like a logical
think
next
that
step
works.
for everyone.
That was like a
Mhm.
plan.
Okay, all right.
Also, would you like us to start narrowing down on some ideas for the survey, open house and pop-up type events? Just to,
Yeah, basically what we would. Because right now, when I think of open house, I'm like, okay, first I got to try to decide what is it that you're going to be asking or showing them. Because I think sometimes when you're doing a master plan, you kind of have a lot of the stuff kind of graphed out. Here's what we're thinking, and then you're getting people's input on it. Like I said, you're not just throwing up a board saying, okay, now tell us.
yeah, I mean, that's actually a good distinction. Early in the process, it would be more of a blank canvas, more of a priority boards or kind of almost like the visual preference survey that we did for the waterfront area. So it'd be the initial type of open house would be different than later. Toward the end of the process, when we have a future land use map and when we have, vision statements and goals, that's where we'd be more presenting the results of the process. Whereas the initial public input would be more of a blank canvas and asking, for direction, asking for priorities.
Okay.
Good to have that early on, so we know, what to study and what to recommend.
I think the survey is important, and then I thought just what STR did where they had the things at the school, I thought those were
Yeah.
very good and a lot of good information. They were a little bit later after that. I'm not sure, and you maybe can give some feedback. To the pop-ups give you good data from that, or is that a little bit more hit and miss?
Well, I think they were valuable during the waterfront
Okay.
preservation
Yep.
process, and even just to have that extra level of outreach. Even if it's one person at the table, just saying, hey, we have a survey that's available, we're gonna have open houses available, here's where you can find information, here's general information, I think those are valuable.
Okay, and it got community involved in it too, yeah. Okay.
The one thing people saw, it was interesting because I have to say the majority of some of the times I was there, we probably had more tourist responses, which as part of a master plan, that is kind of important because they are driving, it's not just the citizens that are supporting our businesses and that, it really is the tourist. But then they don't really understand, some of the complexities. I can guarantee that, parking will be the number one, thing on everyone's list, especially when you're doing it in the summertime. But I'll wait and let the survey, come out, but I'll start making my guesses now.
I like a little bit of all three.
So
So-
we can at least start doing some homework to narrow down on some recommendations for those three efforts. So that we're just not starting from scratch in the end of June. I don't want to get too far into the summer and
Correct.
not have anything for you to review.
And I would ask if Luke, if you can get out the Douglas, obviously we all have ours, but if everyone can, in the next couple of weeks, kind of set it upon yourself to kind of go through, like Craig was saying, and kind of at least give you some pointers as if hey, we think we can just use this, we want to update this, but this is no longer necessary, then you could possibly incorporate that into part of the agenda. So when we come in, here's what we think that we may have already kind of agreed upon, and we can start the discussions there too.
Yeah.
As opposed to waiting until we walk into that.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Anything else on master plan discussion? So today it's 15th. I was thinking if we could our meeting in June is the
19th.
19th.
Mhm.
So like June, I know. And I was like, just June 3rd. That's 2.5 weeks. Would that be sufficient? Because you won't be creating the final packet until
Do it.
A week
following
later.
Friday.
Mhm.
Declare.
Does that work for you?
Mr. Attorney.
Okay.
Yes, survey questions.
Yeah.
All right, moving on to the next new business item, it's sign regulation amendments. I think that's also you, Dave and Luke.
Actually, Trent's going to walk us
Oh,
through
Trent?
this one.
Sorry.
Yeah, he's going to walk us through some initial recommendations based on a review of our current sign regulations. The main takeaway from this one is that our temporary yard signs they need some cleanup and some consistency, frankly. Right now, the different rules that we have for different kinds of signs, obviously we have real estate signs and we have garage sale signs, election signs, and every single one has a different, dimensional standard and other standards. And so the suggestion from staff is that we standardize that a little bit more. And obviously we have to think about the regulation around content as well. So in your packets, there was a comparison table that lines up all the current rules for our temporary signs. And Trent's going to take us through some staff recommendations.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. So just to back up a second, we had talked briefly at the last meeting about why this is important, but I just kind of wanted to go through that again. So, the impulse when drafting sign regulations is to be as specific as possible. And, many, many communities did that for a long time. And that's why you see so many communities that have the content-based regulations, because it makes sense to regulate, political signs differently than, say, construction signs or road signs and that things of that nature. However, in 2015, the Supreme Court sort of turned that all on its head with a case called Reed versus Town of Gilbert. And in that case, there was a church that was posting flyers at various places around town that was just advertising their their next upcoming Sunday service. And it was, the city took issue with that because it didn't meet their temporary sign regulations. And in that case, the regulations were very similar to what the current distinctions are in the city of Saugatuck's sign regulations, based on garage signs and real estate signs and things of that nature. And so the church challenged it, took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court then came out with the now infamous Reed case that said that content-based regulations are subject to strict scrutiny, and so they're almost always overturned when they're challenged. The Reed case set forth sort of two tests for determining if something is content-based, and I think it's sort of helpful background as we walk through some of these exercises that Dave prepared in his memo. The first one is if you have to read the sign to determine whether or not it's subject to regulation, then it's content-based. The second one is a little more nuanced, and it's if the underlying purpose of the sign regulation is to, discriminate against certain content, you can get into trouble there. And so for a while that we had a pretty clean test as to if I have to read the sign to tell if it's regulated, then it's not going to be a good regulation. Then in 2022, the Supreme Court clarified this area of law in a case that came out of Austin, Texas. And that case drew the distinction between on-premise and off-premise cases, signs. And maybe you've heard that on-premise, off-premise distinction before. In that case, the city prohibited the new builds of off-premise signs. And so it was more of a facial challenge alleging that this distinction was unconstitutional under the previously decided case of Reed. And if you think about it, if you have to read the sign to determine if something is on-premise or off-premise, it sort of makes sense. But the court went the other way and came out and said that that's not a content-based regulation. It's more similar to a time, place, and manner restriction. So there's sort of the judicial background. Why is this important? Because sometimes when you're regulating sign ordinances and stuff, it's usually you're permitting freestanding signs and things of that nature that are pretty innocuous. But my office has been involved in some pretty crazy enforcement cases. One of which that comes to mind was in a township that we represent, where a person had almost 100 political signs in their yard. And so it's not really a problem until it becomes a problem. And then when you're trying to enforce, if you have content-based regulations, the city can be kind of, hung out to dry and not be able to enforce their ordinances in that way. So that's kind of the backdrop as to why this is sort of important. I also want to underscore that the city is by far not the only community that still has content-based sign regulations. It's been kind of an ongoing thing. And in fact, in that case I just mentioned that we handled with the 100 political signs, we actually had to file supplemental briefs in the court to explain to the court even sort of the changes in the law and the new standards under the Reed case and the Austin case. And so even though 2015 and 2022 were a few years ago, this is still kind of an emerging issue, and it comes up pretty frequently. So the city is not alone in this endeavor. So then kind of going back to the memo that Dave prepared, and as Luke sort of teed it up, the city's sign regulations are not as content-based as you may think. The primary sign regulations are regulated, or permanent sign regulations are in section 154.141 of the zoning ordinance. And really there's just a couple provisions there that I think would need some cleanup, specifically the flag provisions, and there's a specific exemption related to dock signage that I think could use some cleanup. However, as Luke alluded to, the main sort of cleanup that needs to take place is standardizing the temporary yard signs. These are often also the ones that are subject to an enforcement action because it's pretty rare to have issues with permanent signs. Like I said, it's usually just kind of a question of whether or not they can get the permits and build them according to whatever regulations like setbacks and stuff that are applicable to the permanent signs. It's the temporary ones that can cause problems. And so standardizing those is important. Currently, the city's ordinances, just to provide some examples of the temporary sign regulations, we define political signs as a temporary sign used in connection with an office, city, school, district, county, state, or federal election or referendum. So you can see there how you would have to read the sign to determine whether or not it was subject to those political sign regulations. Same thing for opinion sign. It's defined as displaying a non-commercial message that is political, religious, or personal in nature. A garage sign is to advertise a private sale of personal household possessions, not for any use of any commercial venture. And so those are just kind of a couple examples of sign regulations we could clean up potentially. So the memo, I think, lays this out nicely, especially the chart that Dave provided that walks through the current regulations. Because if you start to think about this from a content neutral perspective, which would mean that we're kind of group these signs together as just temporary signs instead of the 5 or 6 different categories we currently have, I think you can see from those charts how you start to get sort of some consistencies. So for example, like size, aside from the construction sign that allows 32 square feet, the other ones are all within 4, 6, 2 square feet. So they're not that far away. And you can see how you can kind of start to standardize signs like that. And so really, I think the direction for tonight's meeting would just to be have some general discussion about some of these items. And I'll talk about them more specifically in a moment. And then also just some sort of general thinking about what types of issues that you guys identify in the city with signs and what we may want to regulate. Oftentimes, I think this process requires a couple iterations of drafts because, we can get as much direction tonight as we're able to get through. But ultimately, I think when the Planning Commission gets a draft in front of them that has sort of standardized their current regulations, you might have more thoughts about things that we can tweak going forward and change with that. And maybe there's even some overall directional changes we want to make. Like maybe we don't really want to regulate certain things the same way that we did before. And so I think just a general discussion would be helpful in this regard. And maybe just some questions to keep in the back of your mind is like, what types of signs do we want to prohibit? What zoning districts would certain signs be appropriate in and what ones would they not? Do we want to vary our sign regulations based on zoning district? And then whether or not we want to utilize that on-premise, off-premise distinction that I mentioned from the Austin, Texas case, because that can be kind of useful. And so that sort of segues into the 3 main tools I think that are useful when standardizing sign regulations is you can use a distinction between zoning districts. So, what's appropriate in a residential district may not be appropriate in a commercial district and vice versa. That doesn't cause any content-based issues. You can prohibit certain types of signs. So, for example, in the city, since it's so dense and developed, it's probably inappropriate to have a large billboard, right on Butler Street or something like that. And so, that's another tool that you sort of have in the tool belt. As well as I mentioned, the on-premise, off-premise distinction can be useful in some situations. The on-premise, off-premise, I often see it in the context of commercial sign regulations. Like you may be allowed to have a certain dimensional sign if you're advertising the business that is on that property, as opposed to something that's not on that property. A more nuanced sort of take on that is that you can actually draw on-premise versus off-premise distinctions in the residential context too. And so, obviously we can't have the underlying purpose to regulate the content, but you can imagine a situation where you have an on-premise residential sign, which could include like a for sale sign or a garage sale sign, which could be regulated differently than an off-premise residential sign, which could be like your political signs or, anything that has to do with, advertising or speaking about something that's not located on that specific residential property. And so that's a lot to take in, I understand, but I think that it's generally just some good backdrop to have as we sort of move into a discussion of the specifics here. And so standardizing temporary yard signs, I'm looking at number 1 of Dave's memo here. he lists sort of the main tools that can be used to standardize, maximum height, maximum size, maximum number, setbacks, no illumination, and things of that nature. Really, the key is to focus on just time, place, and manner restrictions. And so I think that's sort of the name of the game in that regard. But then moving to flags, which is number 2 of the memo, I think the flags is maybe actually the best example to talk about this with as far as a starting point. Based on my review of the city's flag definitions, and let me pull up, I have it in my notes here. So the city has quite a long flag definition, but essentially it includes, flags of a nation, state, or local, provincial, like any government entity essentially, as well as educational institutions, fraternity organizations or societies. Those are all content-based because you have to read the flag to figure out, if it's subject to this definition. However, it then says no larger than 24 square feet shall be the size permitted. And so no matter what type of content is on the flag, they're capped at 24 square feet. And so that's a really quite easy one to standardize. You just, if that's the, if the desire is to keep the same square footage limitation, that one can be done quite easily. And so you can kind of start, I think, to see how you don't have to abandon your entire sign regulation regime. You just have to sort of tailor it to be content neutral. And in some regards, that might require some distinctions that are not currently in the ordinance. And so to walk through these, I think that maybe the best way would just be to open up some general conversation, and then, I can sort of jump in, and Dave and Luke can jump in whenever they have specific thoughts on things. I think one more thing to note, I guess, is number 4 on Dave's memo says, retain but revise the definitions to remove content references from the definition of banner, bulletin, directional sign. There's nothing wrong with drawing distinctions based on the type of sign, like whether or not it's a banner or a bulletin or a flag or those sandwich board signs that are always in the sidewalk and stuff like that. Those are fine. However, the current definitions that are included in the city's ordinance has some kind of included content-based provisions. And so I have an example of that as well for banners, I believe. So the definition of banner, nothing wrong with drawing a distinction based on banners and regulating banners differently than, say, a wall sign, for example. However, within the definition of banner, it says used to call attention to a business, product, service, or activity. And so, by removing that, we could remove the content-based provision. So that's kind of the general exercise. Some other things that would be helpful is just a general idea of when the Planning Commission would like to consider a draft. And also, what we can do is just try to mirror what you currently have as close as possible and then tweak it going forward. Or we can try and, if there's thoughts tonight or in the coming meetings about specific changes, and, we're happy to implement those as well. So if you're being a bit long-winded, I'll turn it back over to you guys for some discussion, and then we can chime in as needed.
Thank you, Trent.
Yes.
I guess in general, I'm in favor of perhaps differentiating it among some location, zoning district, historic district, again, just spitballing, but in terms of maybe, the number of signs and things like that. I like standardizing sizes. I think people want things that are just obnoxious. I don't think the intent here is for us to get tighter in R1 about political signs and things like that. So that's it off the top of my head. I guess one question. I know currently we need a permit for temporary signs if they are basically advertising. So how are you going to basically, at least that's what I read, and maybe you double check that. If a permit is only required for a temporary sign based on commercial content, are you now going to either get a permit for every temporary sign or just don't want that permits required? So just something I don't think we're looking for whole.
No, I would very much like to not permit every temporary sign. That would be fantastic.
Right.
Thank you. But yeah, good question. Thank you.
And that, could be a place where you would draw a distinction too. Maybe a temporary sign in a commercial district would require a permit if you're thinking about, a business putting out, say, a temporary sign in the sidewalk or something like that, where a residential sign, maybe you wouldn't require a permit. So I think that's a good example.
I have one question too on the offsite. So if a home has a sign made for a lawn service that did work there, is that off premise or on premise sign in your view? Like, can you regulate advertising for services on a property, even if the business isn't located there?
I mean, I see those signs constantly, so I can't imagine we're looking to regulate that any differently than anything else. Trent, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I
assume-
just want to make sure
Totally.
I heard it correctly because Commissioner Baldwin's microphone, I think, might be not working properly. But if the question was like a lawn mowing company that advertises on a property but not their property, that would be an off-premise sign. So, for example, if a lawn mowing company mows someone's lawn and then puts a sign up there, that would be an off-premise sign. If it was in the actual business address, it would be an on-premise sign. Was that the question, or am I missing part of
Yeah,
it?
sorry, now the microphone's on. It's super
Perfect.
loud.
No.
Yeah, that was my question, is if we chose to, we could regulate those without violating the Supreme Court guidelines. So
Yep, exactly. That would be a good example of a residential off-premise sign that you could regulate in that way. Whereas maybe the on-premise version of it would be a little less regulated, or whatever the city's desire is, obviously. But that's a good distinction. And so I think maybe a good
All
exercise.
right, if I could, Trent, I've got a question and I'll see if that goes on or not or whatever. Anyway, so on the Reed decision and the one in 2022, whose name I've forgotten, you seem to say that the city can't regulate if the city, if you have to read what the sign says, we can't regulate it because that becomes content, right?
Correct, yeah, yeah. If it's based
based
on the
on-
content of the message, yeah.
Okay, so I'm looking at page 3 of David's memo. And construction, real estate, rental, garage sign, election sign, opinion sign. Don't we need to then lump them all together because each one of those, you've got to read them to find out what they are?
That was,
Those are our
that's the
existing.
existing.
That's our existing
If you look at
regulations.
page 1 and 2, those are recommendations. So like number 6 of the recommendation is to delete the following definitions, replace it with temporary yard signs. So we no longer have garage signs, political signs, opinion signs, real estate signs.
Right.
They'd all
but-
be lumped underneath temporary yard signs.
Okay, I'm sorry. I did read that and temporary yard signs are an exception to those Supreme Court cases that you can regulate content on temporary yard signs?
No, we're just saying.
Then what difference does it make if they're temporary, if we clarify them as, characterize them as temporary yard signs or we don't? I'm missing.
So a temporary yard sign could be any message at all. It could be a political sign. It could be a sign for a sign for a home business. So because there's no distinction based on the actual message of the sign, that's why a temporary yard sign is an okay distinction. Then I was just trying to take that one step farther and say, we have to group all of these into one bucket of temporary yard signs. But then as under that definition of temporary yard signs, we can then build out distinctions based on zoning districts, based on-premise and off-premise. And we can prohibit certain types of signs as well, based on the structure of the sign, not the content. And so,
All right,
okay, yeah.
thank you. Okay.
So Trent, if we're correct, like when we're looking at what's in existence, like you said, there's not a huge difference. Like we're not able to say that somebody can have a garage sale sign that can't be more than 2 square feet because they could come and say, well, wait, you're telling me that because it's garage sale, you're limiting my ability, because if I called it a opinion sign, I'd be able to do 4 square feet.
Exactly.
But yet if we came to a consensus that, hey, no temporary sign can be greater than 6 square feet, and that applied to all signs, and we've reduced the chance that anybody can say that we're discriminating against their free speech. Because it applies to all temporary signs.
Correct. Yep, that's absolutely correct. You would then be able to enforce those provisions because it wouldn't have any content you know, it wouldn't matter what the content of the sign was. But I've done this enough times in other communities to know that I think that the impulse then is to think, oh, well, we have to completely standardize it. We have to put all temporary yard signs at 6 square feet, and that's the end of it. Which is, you can be much more nuanced than that. So like a temporary yard sign in a neighborhood, in a, you know, a residential zoning district might be capped at 6 square feet, but maybe in a different district, it could be 12 square feet or, you know, 8 square feet, something like that.
Because the only one that I think that I see throughout the community sometimes is the construction ones, Trent. Because if some, like, you know, if they're doing a construction, many times they will actually have a more permanent sign, because that could be there for 6 months to a year. And it lists the name of the contractor, usually will, if they're doing it right, they put the permit in there. And, you know, so to try to say that that's a temporary sign that may fall within like right now, we allow 32 square feet because typically they are going to be a larger sign that's placed in front of a property that's being built. Now,
But isn't there a way to differentiate then based on off-premise?
potentially. So like,
That's what I
yeah.
heard, right? So you can define, correct me if I'm wrong, you can define.
but we wouldn't want to have an off-premise, like a lawn company be able to do a 32 square foot sign in front of somebody's house.
Well, therein lies the problem.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering, I mean, construction signs can't, if we called it a permanent, can that be regulated separately? I mean, permanent being that it's 6 months or longer that it may be on a property.
Yep, that's a distinction you can draw. I do think for that's a great example, and I was thinking about this before the meeting. I think that we can craft provisions in such a way that would allow sort of more specific regulations as to construction signs. It's hard to do off the top of my head. It might be something that takes some thinking, but if that's something the planning commission is you know, interested in carving out, we can think about how to do it. I think, you know, Commissioner Clark's point is good about on-premise, off-premise distinction in that regard. Like if a, sign is advertising, or, you know, a sign is related to what is the conditions of that current property kind of thing, you may be able to do it that way, but I'll have to think about that a little bit more, I think.
We could potentially link it to whether or not there's an open building permit, maybe, or some kind of, you know, active zoning permit to some degree, whether it's, you know, an addition or alteration or a single family residential build, or some trigger that or some standard that has a timer as well, so that, okay, well, now that you're done with the build and you've got occupancy, now you can't have it anymore. I think as of right now, it is based on occupancy. So once that's granted, you've got to remove the sign.
Then
So
you get into remodeling and all that sort of
But
stuff.
but I do think that when I look at it, it's kind of like when we get ready to look at the zoning, there's so much similarity for us to be able to kind of say, hey, we could call it all temporary, give a maximum size of this, you know, how many can you have? That's somewhat straightforward and we could almost move forward with it. It's just when we get to the exceptions.
Yeah.
You know, and I think the exception really is construction. And banner, I think, is an exception when it comes to the other temporary, only because we use banners underneath the Saugatuck sign, and this is like 16 square feet. And I'm like, I think some of our banners have definitely been larger than, you know, it's like, so it's, but that's just my thoughts. And I don't know how that, you know, to not be able to say that you can't, you know, regulate, so like on a banner, we're not saying that we're regulating the content, we're just trying to set the size.
Right.
So,
Another potential avenue, I think Luke's point is well taken and something we could actually consider, you know, linking it to that. But another thing that may be useful in the construction context, is you can draw the distinction based on the physical type of sign. So if it's like a freestanding sign, you know, you can do it that way as well, or a wall sign or a, you know, something like that. And so that may be something that would be applicable as well. And maybe it could be something like in a residential area, you could have a freestanding sign up to, you know, whatever square footage we were talking about, 30 square feet, for a duration of 6 months or something like that, like a temporary freestanding sign in a residential district, I think is a potential avenue as well.
yeah, because when I think of the construction signs, the ones that I've seen, they're more, I call them almost a permanent because usually there's like 2 4x4s that are in the ground and they're solid wood. They're not just like little, banner signs or something. So it's, and we don't have tons of them, but they do appear throughout in some parts of the city.
Yeah, I think we need to carefully think through that one, because it's a good idea to put like a time frame around it and say you can have a freestanding sign of whatever square feet up to 6 months. But boy, I can just see that when election season come, everybody's going to put up temporaries, they're going to put up temporary signs, right? And you're going to.
That's why I was thinking if we can somehow link it to just a construction, like you're saying, if you have a permit, if you're remodeling, you should have a permit.
A permit sign?
So like if the permit is
Yeah.
outstanding, then you're able to have this temporary sign advertising the construction, something like that.
We've done that in other communities. I think every municipal attorney is gonna have a different comfort level on how we regulate this, but we have done other communities where we have tied it to an open building permit from the time permitted to occupancy. And it would, the regulation would simply say that you can have an extra temporary yard sign or a temporary yard sign up to X square feet during an active building permit. But again, it's still gonna call it a temporary yard sign. It's not gonna say anything about what's on it. That's how it's handled in some other communities, but again, I think that is a kind of a outlier, is something we're gonna have to assess on how best to handle that.
Right.
And maybe 32 square feet is probably, that might be a little large as well. I think.
Sheet of plywood. Sheet of plywood.
Construction projects, if those signs out there today are as big as a piece of plywood, I think a lot of them are probably not that big.
No, they're not.
So,
Now 32 is very large. I can't imagine. But again, the ones that are there, I'm like, wait,
It's probably 4x4. The ones that, a couple I'm thinking of are probably 4x4 half sheet.
there's one 5, I think it's 5x3, but it's still only 15
Yeah.
square feet.
Yeah.
Since we're talking about construction signs, the situation where this seems very common, you have multiple. You'll have the architect sign, you'll have the contractor sign, and then you'll have the subs. When they're doing their sub work, will put their signs in. So we're talking about one permanent sign that will be, Zahn Construction or Zahn Architect or whatever. Are we saying that under this, you won't be able to have half a dozen signs in a construction site house or renovation? Is that, I'm confused.
We could limit the number of signs.
but I think there's a couple different ways to do it. I mean, you could just say you have up to this number of square feet. And then how you want to divide that up is up to the people posting the signs. So that's one way to handle it too. If we say, if we tie it to a building permit, again, we're gonna chat about this with Trent offline. But if we do it that way, you might say 20 feet, 25 feet, 32 feet, square feet, whatever it might be. We might say that is divided by one sign, 2 signs, or as many signs as you want from that you get from that square footage. So I think that's something that we could build into the framework for you to review.
So 132 square foot sign or 32
But it's-
1 square foot sign.
Or else, if you can tie it in, correct,
That,
you can have it tied in, if there's a permit, there, like if we only said you can have one sign per, frontage, but if it's a permitted use that's currently, or whatever's happening is underneath the permit, they could have a different number then. We'd be able to designate, they could have up to 8 signs or 6 signs or whatever.
That's not a strange idea either. I mean, that's actually how we regulate attached signs at the minute. You can
Right.
have 2 attached signs, but it can't be more than a certain square footage when it's combined. So.
That's what I commonly see it that way too, even with temporary yard signs. Like you can have up to 16 square feet of temporary yard signs, whether you want to have, 3 small ones or 1 big one, it's up to you.
One other question. We have a separate temporary sign regulation. That's 150.30. Since we're doing this, is it possible? Is there a benefit? Should we leave it alone? Should we incorporate 150.30 into our zoning ordinance of 154?
Yeah, I think so. I think that it makes more sense to have it all. in
Is
the
that in
zoning
this memo
ordinance.
too, and I missed it? Okay, good.
That's a good point, because I didn't understand why they were separate to start with.
Did read the packet. Thank you.
Yeah, sometimes there's advantage to have it outside of the code, but in our offline conversations, we thought we should probably just put this all in zoning.
Okay,
So it all fall in 154,
Keep it
141,
under sign requirements, yeah, 154, 15, 141.
141.
Mhm.
So it's to have regulating permanent signs, some communities will regulate those in police power ordinances outside of zoning because you don't have the same type of non-conformity protection as you would in a zoning ordinance. But since we're dealing primarily with temporary yard signs, it's not something that we can really get legal non-conforming status of a temporary yard sign because it is temporary. So in that case, there's really no benefit to being outside of zoning.
So Dave, if we all agreed that we would want to set a maximum height, the maximum size, maximum number, things that you kind of recommended. Are you going to come back with a recommendation for these numbers? Or are you looking for us to say, no, we think the maximum height should be 4 feet. We think the maximum size should be. You want that from us, or you want to give us something based upon what you've seen in other cities, other locales?
I think what we can do is work with Trent to develop a framework. And there might be some placeholder numbers, there might be some blanks, but if we can have this whole thing crafted for you, and then we can have the conversation.
I think it'd be great.
But I think internally, we'll probably discuss what we recommend. But I think as you noticed before, that there are, between 2 and 6 square feet is kind of that sweet spot.
Right.
There's gonna be the outlier for the construction sign, which we'll make recommendations on. But I think once we have the framework set up, we can calibrate that up and down as you wish.
Right. So I think it would be helpful if we had this, 154, 141, kind of rewritten in a draft form with proposals, and then you can say, do you all agree with the 6 square feet? Or do we think, flags should be limited to 20 feet versus 28 feet or whatever? It's, but at least it's already kind of written and we can read it and it's.
something that you recently said moments ago that gave me a minor alarm was leaving it up to putting a maximum, I'm talking about residential temporary signs or in residential districts, giving the homeowner the option of whether they have a 32 square foot sign or 4 2 by something's signs. I don't want to live next to a house that decides that, okay, I'm just going to put up 1 sign. That was worrying to me, to give it the homeowner the option of how many signs, or just give them a square footage and I mean, I drive around some areas and see very large signs that if in a compact residential area, I think would be not conducive to the neighborhood.
I think that was specifically a point for construction. If we had a open building permits, try and link that one to having an open building permit. I don't think we're looking to allow someone to have a 32 square foot yard sale sign.
Okay, because
Or
I
something that-
swear I heard somebody say for residential, they could also have, you could decide how big. I know a few minutes ago, we talked about construction, like,
Yeah,
do you get a bunch of subs or do you get one big sign? But then just much after that, just a moment or two ago, I thought we also were talking, that was floated, the idea was floated, a similar kind of idea for a homeowner to decide whether they put up a big sign or they put up 4 smaller signs.
I think we're all of the opinion that having a maximum square footage of like 4 or 6 is probably more appropriate. I don't think anyone's looking to allow
Okay.
yeah, for a regular
Just wanted to
temporary sign.
Throw that out there before. we
No,
go any further.
absolutely. Makes sense.
Thank you.
I think the quantity will be interesting and where you set that, the
Right.
quantity of the smaller signs even.
So with the size, we can also say, is it 1, is it 2? We can still make that decision later on as well, but. So that the number, the size, in terms of the time, placement, manner of the signs, those are all fair game. So if we say 4 square feet, 2 signs, 6 square feet, 1 sign, that's for us to decide, and that will be in our framework so that you'll be able to make those decisions as we walk through line by line.
And all of this in terms of number of signs, I mean, because the Supreme Court case was talking about content of the sign. All of this about number of signs, size of signs, that's required, or are we just doing it because since we're cleaning up the content provisions, we might as well be consistent on size and numbers and because I'm envisioning you driving around town election time with a tape measure and a violations pad. And I don't think you want to be doing that.
That
So
doesn't
it-
sound amazing, no. But I suppose it is required because of currently how we have it broken out. We have it, as we said, we have it by whether is it a rental sign or is it a yard sale sign? Is it a construction sign? So we have to have something in place because we can't just remove them and have no, maximum dimensional standards. But I see your point. Yes, we probably don't want me policing, signs to the nth degree, but
Well,
we
technically,
also
that
have,
problem exists today.
sorry.
I mean,
Well, technically, yeah.
technically, you
that does,
could
yeah.
go around
If
and
somebody,
measure all the
someone
political
has
signs and
concerns
stuff.
about a sign,
It's
but
almost more complicated because there's so many, yeah, I
Correct.
know we're going down, gonna try and narrow the
Right, at
scope.
least we're saying that, hey, any temporary sign can be up to the site.
But of
as
course,
opposed to,
there was a suggestion about, and I've lost my place now, but there was a suggestion about less policing. I forget how it was worded, but around the time of election, I think the plan was to suspend.
A number of communities are waiving, they're just not enforcing, or they're saying there is no limit on the number of signs, X number of days before election, X number of days after. And I'm not gonna speak for Trent, but I think that we'll have a legal opinion on our defensibility of that. And if we should have any limit during election season, or if we should leave that open, because that is an area that I think we would get most challenges of any concerning temporary yard signs. A lot of communities are just saying, we're not enforcing, or we are going to just make it unlimited during this time period. But we're gonna come back with, let's address that now.
No, I think if that's something that the planning commission is interested in, drawing a distinction based on like the time near an election or something like that, that's something we can absolutely prepare a legal opinion on. It's a bit more nuanced, but it's definitely something to consider, and we'd be happy to do a legal opinion on that. And then just one point about, the enforcement piece is, even currently now to enforce, you would still have to kind of go around with a ruler and figure out, if it meets the threshold for size, for example, or height or whatever the issue is. The only distinction is that, you could look at the political sign and say like, oh, is that political sign hitting the threshold? Now we can't look at the political sign. We have to look at all signage. And my second point about enforcement is, it's ultimately the city has discretion as to whether or not to enforce these provisions. I don't know how often they've been enforced in the last couple of years, but it's not necessarily something that has to be heavily policed. I think it's just nice to have content neutral regulations so that if a problem does show up, say the example I mentioned of the person putting 100 political signs in their front yard, when those issues come up, we can then address them. So I think that's kind of the need for the change, not necessarily to make it stricter or to require, Luke to go around and heavily police these new regulations. That's not the idea.
Regulations that are not enforced. Well,
makes total sense, doesn't it? Anything else on signs you guys would need from us at this time?
I think we received enough input to put together a framework, and just knowing that there may be some placeholder numbers and areas for discussion, that we'll highlight those in the framework.
Very good. Anything else from any of the fellow commissioners? We're all good, ready? And let's move on to item C, which is 550 Newgrass, site plan review. We'll do first was last, Luke to kind of give us an update.
Sure. Yeah. So 550 Dunegrass, this item involves a couple different things. Partly it's a retroactive request for approval of work that's already been done at 550 Doongrass, as well as a site plan proposal for a new driveway at the neighboring property of 500 Doongrass. Just as some background, in 2024, the property owner cleared some vegetation, removed several trees and did some regrading. And this work took place within the existing dune system, which is subject to special land use conditions and site plan requirements. The site is, I'm sure you guys are all aware, it's a part of the old Presbyterian camp where each new home requires planning commission approval. But so does any kind of driveway plan or vegetation removal that also requires site plan approval. So in front of you today is both the retroactive request and the request for the new driveway. Currently, the site itself is being used as a recreational area for 500 Doongrass, but the long-term plan is to build a house at 550. When that plan, comes to fruition, it will be brought back to you. At this time, we're just looking at the driveway and the vegetation removal. So the owner has proposed a restoration plan regarding the removal of the vegetation that includes planting of some red maple trees and some shrubs and other native plantings and some dune grass plugs to run along the slope of the driveway. So we have Adrian Peterson here from Peterson and Vandenberg Environmental, who has a presentation for us.
No, it's fine. Yeah, no, it's fine, just like that, so. Yep, so yeah, I'm Adrian Peterson with Peterson and Vandenberg Environmental, just here to walk through the revegetation plan for 550 Doongrass. To give you an idea of what's out there and what it looks like and what we want to do, or what the owner wants to do out there. So the purpose of the project was really to stabilize this area. It had been used for like temporary construction access when they did some shoreline protection work, and also staging of material. So it was kind of disturbed already. And so he not only wanted to, stabilize it, to make sure that sand doesn't keep blowing around, but also to have a place for his kids to play soccer and football, used for recreation. But also, they put in a little grassy swale from this area into the dune grass just to help with the stormwater management. And then the driveway, again, when they did the construction work, they kind of put a construction access through, but it's not stable. It needs to be stabilized with dune grass and kind of finished off so that when they do get ready to build, the driveway will be already set and they won't have to impact that area again. So that's kind of the plan. Okay, next one. So this again shows the previous site conditions, just disturbed open area. Next slide. And then this is what it looks like today. You can it's kind of hard to see where that construction access is because it's underneath that line, but you can see it's open sand. It's pretty steep sided right now. So they're having a hard time getting it to stabilize. So they want to restore it. And so the past activities that were done out there was removal of vegetation, including the 4 living trees and 12 dead trees. A lot of them have the hemlock woolly adelgia out there. And then they also removed 25 to 50 tons of landscape boulders. And that was kind of left on place from lay down area. And then they installed that little drainage swale that I just mentioned. And then they graded out the area. It was already pretty flat, but they just flattened it out a little bit, added some topsoil so that they could put the grass in. Next one. So the proposed activities. So we met with Eagle, the Eagle staff out on site to take a look at it. And he wanted us to remove the fill piles that are along, they kind of had stockpiled them along the driveway. And some of them were kind of backing up into the dune slope. So he asked that those be removed, and some of it will be used for in the driveway. To kind of, because right now it's kind of a very steep little valley. They want to raise it up a little bit, so it's, the side slopes aren't so long. And then all the excess material will be stockpiled in a location that was found acceptable by the Eagle staff, which is kind of doesn't back into any of the big dunes, the forested dunes. And then the proposed plantings, in order to replace those trees, those 4 trees that were removed, proposing 6 red maples. And that would be a 1.5 to 1 ratio of replacement. And then also 3 red osier dogwoods and 1 witch hazel shrub, kind of where the dune comes down, the steep dune, forested dune, just to give it a little more vegetation after that, those fill piles are pulled back. Next one. This is just the overall plan, just so you can get an idea of
Yep.
what you have in your information, but,
Yep.
and then the next one. And then this is the lawn area, kind of outlined with the green. The blue arrows are the drainage swale. And then the trees that were removed, and then the replacement trees. I did shift them a little bit in this plan to move down outside of the forested area. Just to, because when we went back out there, it's pretty forested in that kind of that east corner.
Correct.
So we're thinking about moving it down, unless you guys have a concern with it, then we'll leave them where we had them proposed. Next one. This is the temporary construction access. You can kind of see the topo lines underneath are really steep. And so they're going to raise that up a little bit, and then so that the side slopes aren't as steep, and then put dune grass all through that area to stabilize it. They're going to do the dune grass probably this fall, because we're kind of running out of time to do it right now. It's best if it's done in the fall when it won't get burned. So if they do want to start the work soon, so they would put some mulch blanket down on the side slopes to hold them in place. And they're going to make it probably 20 feet wide, as required by the fire marshal, just so they don't have to upset the area again. Okay, next one. Then these are the little fill piles next to the road that will be taken out and used in the driveway, or any excess will be put in that kind of pink area. And then the shrubs will be placed in those areas. So we did have as I stated, the Eagle staff out on site, and they have issued a permit for all this proposed activities. So we're all cleared with them, so that's good. Some site photographs so you can get an idea what it looks like. The one on the right is the existing grassy swale that goes down. Proposed driveway location, you can see it's kind of very disturbed and the side slopes are very steep, so they want to take care of that so they can get it stabilized. Next one. This is the mowed grass area. Those stakes are actually marking out the proposed house in the future. They're wanted to get an idea of what it would look like out there. So it takes up this between the septic system and the house. It's going to take up pretty much the whole mowed grass area. And then if you can see in the back, kind of on the one on the left, that's where we were thinking that the red maple tree should go, because it's a little more open. There's more room, more light, after we're back out there looking at it. Next one. Again, this is the existing lawn, and then the fill piles at the end of the driveway that are going to be taken out, so that that natural dune can restore back to the way it was. Next one. Overall, taking all this mowed grass out, only to build in the next, they're hoping 1.5 to 2 years. It's going to take a while to do the design and apply for all the permits. So it'd probably be about 1 to 2 years. And then, but the dune grass, the trees, the shrubs, and the dune grasses will all be done as soon as possible. We wanted to get through this meeting first before the landscapers did the work. And then, let's see. Yeah, that's it. Next one. Any questions?
Did Eagle have a comment about where you placed the trees? Because you said you were gonna you might not do them in one spot, might do them in another.
Yeah.
Was that?
He didn't really care where we put them as long as they were replaced. I
Okay.
haven't shown him this new plan. Again, I thought I'd run it by you guys first and then send him an email and say, hey, are you okay with this change? Since it's a pretty minor change.
Well, one thing I can tell you is we do appreciate this is probably one of the most thorough site plan reviews as far as, really walking us through what you're trying to do. And when, I'm assuming that the owner is okay with that being a permanent easement to that
Yes.
property?
He actually owns both.
But he owns both of them currently, but if they ever sold 550
That's,
or
that's the only
500.
way to get to that site.
I know it is,
So-
because I've been
so
there
yes.
many times, so it's a
There currently actually is an easement in place, but it looks like they might have to shift it a little bit.
little bit, okay.
So,
And I do appreciate because the only other way to try to do it, you'd have to go through the forest and build almost like a bridge and it would have destroyed.
Yeah.
I'm sure Eagle would have never approved
yeah,
it.
they would not have
Yeah.
approved it. So so that easement has to be there.
Any other questions? I think it's rather clean. I know on page 15, there was recommendations by a consultant and ourselves as far as, what all's been met, and if we thought it was a good plan, there's even a potential motion that's in there.
I have a question for Luke.
Sure.
How does this happen in terms of it being a retroactive approval?
Well, I don't know that the owner of the property was aware that they were required to gain approval back when they did the work. So I don't think anything was malicious, but obviously, essentially back in late 2024, I was notified of an Eagle violation. And then I sort of started to discover, okay, all right, well, actually they need site plan review for removing trees. So even though Eagle were comfortable and they approved the process, it still was required to come to you. How does it happen in terms of process? It's pretty new to me to approve a retroactive application like this one, but essentially, as it stands right now, the property is not conforming, and this would make it conforming.
I think it's a good site plan
It's a
as
good
well. I think a lot of work's gone into it, but I also harbor a little bit of a concern that over the retroactive nature in this, I mean, there have been examples in the past in our town where there have been, let's do what we want and ask for forgiveness later. And, not that we can do anything about it, I know, but
That's
it's a concern of mine.
for the owner and for the others. I mean, I can't speak directly for them, but I can say that there were parcels in Dunegrass that were exempt from site plan reviews. This technically wasn't one of them, but during the time that they actually built the home, it wasn't brought to their attention that they needed a site plan review, and that was 2 planning directors ago. And so the construction and the owner themselves built the entire home, and all they had to have was Eagles approval. They didn't have any site plan approval submitted, or it didn't come before the planning commission. So when it came to like doing this work, they assumed that if they were able to build their entire home and all their property without it, then they just want to do something to the neighboring property. So it's,
And
that's how it kind of came about, was the
Yeah.
fact that they were never made aware initially.
I also have a concern for work being done without permits. Obviously, that's sort of my whole deal here. It's not overly common, but I have been catching that here and there. And so I've issued multiple stop work orders. Obviously, if we saw this happening, we would have issued a stop work order and brought it, to your attention immediately.
I wasn't being critical of.
No, of course,
Of you at all.
Yeah,
I'm just-
absolutely.
It's just a general concern, right? Because it.
Yeah.
And I completely believe you that
Yeah, I mean,
that this wasn't an intentional, it was a
Right.
mistake.
Only
but-
because if you go back, you could see that there was no site plan presented when they were doing the original homes that are in that, along that same strip. It's, now some of them were exempt because the developer and the first ones next to his got exempt in the original Dunegrass agreement. But,
So there's no developer involved in these activities. 'Cause typically they're the ones that should be knowledgeable enough to go for the
Yeah, no, those properties, the ones that were closest to his, got exempt from necessary. And I think when this one got built, and when I was just kind of looking back at it, it just didn't get picked up by the city that it was not, that it was the first lot that actually required. You know, and again, I have no idea. I wasn't part of the dune grass thing back in the, what was that 14 and 15? When I was reading through it, and all of a sudden you have of all the lots, and like 6 of them can, move forward without having any type of site plan review, and the rest of them had to be reviewed. I think it had to do with what they were claiming was they didn't sit on critical dune the way the other properties do.
Well, and we've since had multiple meetings with the developer, who's very
Very good.
very responsive. Yeah, and a lot of communities regulate things differently. Obviously, to some people might say, oh, it was just landscaping. Obviously, an eagle violation is a little more than landscaping, but I don't see this being a threat really to, I don't think anyone's going to try and sneak up a house. It'd be a pretty bad move if they did.
Yeah.
But I see your point. Yeah, you don't want to set any precedents that, oh, well, it just gets okayed
that is-
either.
that is-
Yeah, exactly.
right.
In this case,
You have a builder that's
turns out
involved, they
that-
should know it's not incumbent upon the city, it's incumbent upon the builder and the
Correct.
property owner to make the,
Absolutely.
follow the process.
luckily, in this case, it appears to be quite appropriate work and, plans. So,
Because if, not that it matters for this case, but I think if you go back and look at it, I think 500 might be the last one that did not require a site plan review. 550 is the first one that would. So technically, they're not building on one, so that's kind of, I'm just trying to understand where the owner came from. But
but when they build a house,
When they
you guys,
build-
you guys will see it.
yeah, that one,
Yes.
because
Yeah.
I think that's where the critical dune starts, is at 550, if I'm not mistaken. Although I would claim that the developer's home is like critical dune, but that's a whole separate issue. Any other questions or comments from the group? Do we have anyone that would like to make a motion in regards to this proposal?
I move to approve the vegetation removal and restoration plan and the driveway site plan for 550 Dune Grass Circle Drive based on satisfaction of the site plan approval standards of section 151.060 documented in the staff memo dated May 9, 2025. Approval is contingent upon the following. 1, all proposed vegetation is installed during the 2025 planting season. 2, an easement is established on 500 Dune Grass Circle Drive for access from Dune Grass Circle Drive to 550 Dune Grass Circle Drive. And 3, all applicable approvals are granted, including but not limited to the fire department, the city engineer, and Eagle.
I'll second.
Having the motion and second it, I will ask the clerk then to do a roll call, please.
Yes.
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 And Nance?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Thanks for the presentation. That moves us to commercial district zoning and district review. And that starts in our packet on page 40. And that's again based on a exceptional job in kind of laying out kind of what exists today and some recommendations for things for us to consider, but I'm going to let Dave kind of kick this off and walk through. I think most people had a chance to read it, but this gives you an idea of what we have in place currently.
Okay. So I think we've saved the most complicated to last, although signs may be a little bit more complicated legally. So as we discussed 2 months ago, we're going to go through an exercise of assessing our commercial districts as well as our residential districts to make changes, potentially some consolidations, and to assess the dimensional land use requirements of commercial and residential districts. So this was the really initial effort to begin to compare the commercial districts and more focus really on C1 City Center, C1 Water Street North, C1 Water Street South, and C2 Water Street East. So I call these really the focus areas of this effort, because this is probably where there's the most opportunity for consolidation or revision. So the tables, exhibits 1 and 2 include the land use regulations between all of the districts. Well, I'm sorry, exhibit 1 is all of the districts,
Commercial.
commercial land use regulation, and then exhibit 2 is the focus areas. Exhibit 2 then was, I'll touch on this a few minutes ago. Exhibit 2 is taking an effort to see where we can really combine and where where we need distinction, if any. So if we back up there first to exhibit 1, land use regulation for all of our commercial districts, I look at this table and I say, wow, there's really not a lot here not a lot of commonality between these districts. This just really makes sense, and how can we begin to narrow down based on this table? So in some of the reason for that is because we have an old, antiquated list of land uses. And there are certain land uses that are very specific but they're really of the same class in a way. So you'll have things like offices or domestic business repairs or personal services, retail. And so some of these really share the same type of characteristics. You walk in, there's display area, there's places you can buy something or get something fixed. Or have some consultation with a real estate agent or with an attorney or something like that. So when we have so many different specific uses and they're not generalized, in general terms like office, retail, restaurants, when we have all these very specific uses and they don't really carry across to the districts in the same manner. So for instance, you might have something that is not allowed in one district, but allowed in another district. But then you have a very similar use that is allowed in both districts. So if you were just to combine that use into like a general office category, there'd really be no reason to allow it in one and not allow it in the other. So exhibit 2 is really kind of a first attempt to see how we could begin to consolidate or find the common aspects between our focus area districts, which is the 4 I mentioned earlier. So City Center, Water Street North, Water Street South, Water Street East. So in this table, I wish we had a video of me going through this exercise, making all the changes one by one, but as I was working through these, as you see, the list of uses is shorter. So we've done some combining, and then I made some very simple changes to some of these just to ensure that they were similar across the board, because I really, as I was assessing the districts and considering the character of them really on the ground, I couldn't really see any real need to say, hey, this use is not permitted here where it is here. There's between Water Street North, Water Street South, and Water Street East, like there's not a lot of reasons where you would say one use is allowed and one's not. I think City Center is a little bit different. I think that is a new district. But again, there's a lot of the same types of uses that are allowed there. In City Center, I think obviously there's no single family or 2 family buildings in City Center. I don't want to say that. I'm sure there might be something non-conforming, not where, but in general, it's not a place where we want new single family houses to go up in City Center. And we also have some restrictions on first floor professional offices. So I think in City Center, we want our first floor facing the street to be something more active and vibrant, like a restaurant or retail. So there's some reasoning for that, and I think that's there, and that should be retained. But as you look at the table here, I've coded this in a way where it says like S to NP, that's special to not permitted, or P to NP, permitted to not permitted. So some of these are just kind of begin to be weeded out, like for instance, charter fishing tours, marina, commercial boats, things like that. None of these areas are on the waterfront. So those are really handled through our new waterfront preservation zoning district, which is the entire waterfront. We have some Water Street South, which is close, but still, I think a portion of that was brought into the waterfront preservation district. So there's no more need to allow for any of the waterfront uses within really any of these districts. And then as we look at these other things like domestic business repairs and personal service establishments. A common definition for personal service establishment would be something like a salon or a barber shop or maybe a watch repair store, or something like that, where business, domestic business repairs, I'm really not sure what that is, but it could, I know that we chatted about that a couple of months ago, or maybe during the waterfront process, but again, there's really not any purpose to call that out specifically, when we could just say general offices, general services, retail, restaurants. We give a very short, concise list of more generalized land uses, and also, we can, when we look at this, do all these need to be special or permitted? We can say, okay, what are the ones with the actual impact? What are the ones we are concerned about? Let's make those special versus things that are commonly found in our downtown area or transitional commercial districts. Those might be permitted versus special. So as I went through that exercise, it was difficult to justify distinction between the districts as it related to land use regulation. Now, then when we get into Exhibit 3, is our that includes the dimensional requirements. So that's setbacks, lot area, lot depth, width, lot coverage, stories, minimum building width. And this is also, when I look at this table, it's hard to find common aspects between the districts, especially when you have variations in each district. So for instance, if you see C1 Water Street North, there's note 3, note 4, note 5. Note 3 is for restaurants and recreational transportation. Note 4 is for single family, 2-family, and home businesses. And note 5 is for similar, but we have in each zoning district, there's mainly different lot width and lot area requirements depending on land use. And that's not really necessary to have in zoning district regulation. I think each district could have one minimum lot size, one minimum width, and then if there are uses that you feel really need more land or really need a wider lot, you would call that out specifically in your special land use requirements or specific use requirements. So let's just say, like, one of the examples is I think it is like a theater. For a theater in a certain zoning district, you need, instead of 4,000 and change square feet, you need 8,000 square feet. That doesn't need to be in the zoning district regulation itself. That could be at the use specific requirement. So, and as we do that, as we pull out some of those use specific requirements, now these districts start to look a lot more similar. So if you look at Exhibit 4 with our focus areas, they're closer. And especially if you to remove the notes, you would see that a lot of them are they're ranged in 4,000 to 6,000 square feet. And they're only going to be larger lots where there's a specific land use that's concerning. So for instance, when I look at Water Street South, note 7, we have a 13,200 square foot minimum lot size. So, okay, well, why do we need that? So note 7 says hotel, inn, motel, motor car, motion picture facility, marina, commercial, private. So this is saying we need more land for those. And so we could still do that, as I said, through specific use requirements elsewhere. Or we might say, hey, the size of the lot is going to dictate what is the appropriate use. So if there is a lot and let's just say it's just conforming at 6,600 square feet. Really, the site plan for a hotel or an inn would just have to be adjusted to be able to fit that type of lot. If they couldn't fit it, if it didn't make sense, if it was too much for that lot, it just wouldn't be built there. As we look at some of these dimensional requirements between these districts, they're closer. They're obviously not as, I can't do the exact same exercise as the land use exercise, because there are some that we'd have to see how we can combine them and what makes sense, but they're not that far off in terms of dimensional requirements. So overall, I think my initial observations with these comparisons analysis is that, first off, C2 Water Street South, it really seems like it could be absorbed in the C1 city center. And this is not because when I look at those districts, the regulations are the same and they should be combined, but when you actually look at that block, looks like the blocks in city center. And Steve and I chatted a little bit about this. There is a single family house there, and single family houses, I believe, are allowed in Water Street South. And we could still transfer that area into city center, but we could do a carve out. We could say existing single family homes are permitted. And that's kind of a way to get around it, so you wouldn't make it non-conforming. Or you could say in city center, in that particular block, the single family home is allowed. So there's a way we can do some carve outs for, the one or two issues that make that district necessary right now. Otherwise, they could really be, we could get rid of Water Street South and just rezone that to city center.
Great.
And just make sure that there's not gonna be any unanticipated consequences with creating nonconformity. So I think we really look at that block and we say, why do we need this? Is it just because that one house? Is it because, I think there might be one other issue that needed Water Street South, but we could also kind of pull that into city center.
Correct.
And then my last point is the C1 Water Street North and C2 Water Street East. We may be able to combine those. And you're saying that maybe this is more of a commercial transition district, or if it's really just Water Street North and Water Street East, maybe we just call it the Water Street District.
Right.
And I think all the land uses are very similar, as we showed in the previous table. But there are some differences between lot coverage and side setbacks, and that would be something that we need to work through. So we don't want to take away rights that someone already has. For instance, in Water Street, I think Water Street North is a little bit more open-ended in how much you can develop of that property. But is there a way we can begin to kind of mold these two into one without taking away rights of one versus the other? So I think that might be when I look at this, those were really my two main observations, without really doing a block by block walk. Just looking at aerials for this case.
Well, Dave, I thank you for putting this together, especially the comparisons, because I think it's been something that ever since we developed waterfront preservation, we've talked about what was left of Water Street North and Water Street South. And we've mentioned many times the idea that Water Street South could easily become part of city center, because when you look at the businesses, if you're looking at New Holland Brewery versus going across the street to the new brewery is going to be opening up, come on, they're exactly the same. I did speak with you. At first, I kind of thought, well, maybe Water Street South, Water Street East, and Water Street North should all be put in one district and call it, the Water Street or the commercial adjacent. The issue that I had, and I think we both agreed, is that 4 of the 5 properties down here in Water Street South, because they are much more like city center, cover 100% of the lot. So we would not want to include them, because then they become all non-conforming if you put them into like the Water Street part of one. So I think it really does make sense to have it merged into city center. The idea of Water Street East and Water Street North being merged, to me, has made sense ever since we did the waterfront preservation. I think the only thing that we would have to really do is look at that maximum lot coverage. And my sense is, and I want to hear from everyone here, is that we all kind of agreed at one point that there shouldn't be allowed anything to cover 100% on that east side of Water Street. And I know that it was only allowed for certain type of businesses that could go in those lots at the very, very northern end. But if we were to make a decision that said, okay, this new Water Street district can have no more than 60% lot coverage, the only one that's possibly affected is a couple of lots that were allowed for 100% lot coverage. But those are lots that, as you're coming around that curve, coming down Water Street, would you ever really want a building that goes lot line to lot line? No, it doesn't fit with the character of the downtown. So I don't have an issue in myself, but being in favor of having a limit that would be across the entire zone. And yes, you'll have 1 or 2 property owners that will say that they're being restricted, but currently they're not covering more than that 60%. It would only be maybe restricted from ever building something bigger than what's currently there. And I don't have an issue myself in regulating that.
Conceptually, I understand where you're going. I agree. I think there's probably a reasonable argument from existing landowners that you could be impacting the commercial valuation of the property by changing the zoning, right, to restrict how much of the land they can occupy, whether or not that's a material in the decision. I don't know, it's something that probably needs to be thought through, but the spirit of what you've outlined, I certainly, agree with.
I agree too. I like with South moving it into city center, those businesses really match. I either carve out for the one or two makes sense. The way you combine the land use to be a little more generic so that it wasn't such a variation between the districts is a nice cleanup. The lot coverage in south and east and north there's gonna be a couple of contentious issues there that we'll have to figure out.
Yeah, I think when I was kind of looking, I threw out the number of 60% because when you kind of go across the chart, for Water Street North and Water Street East, Water Street East is got a 65%. And everything except for the restaurant and recreational facilities was limited in Water Street North at 50%. So it's only if somebody wanted to build a restaurant or recreational
Right.
transportation that they'd be able to build lot line to lot line anyway. And is that really appropriate for that kind of neighborhood? You could kind of question it. If they were building anything else, they were limited at 50. So if you actually made it something that was 60, yeah, you're reducing the Water Street East by 5%, or maybe you make it all 65%. So you're actually giving them the ability that they can be building
Yeah.
more on the lot, except that if they wanted to build these two types of establishments, they can't build 100%. You can go 65%. And I think and I like the idea that we've got, across the street, if somebody like Retro Boats, wanted to add in, their cafe and that, they can't go lot line to lot line anymore. They have to have a setback and so why would we allow the one on the east side of Water Street to potentially go lot line to lot line when we have the ones on the water, at least have a minimum size. So, but I really do think that it comes down to now the minimum lot areas. I agree with Dave. I think we can just say, hey, 1/10 of an acre, which is the 4356 is the minimum size. If somebody wants to have a 4356 lot and they can put a viable business on it, does it really affect us? No. I mean, again, you can kind of lay it out in the use. If we want to have a hotel, has to have at least 8,700. You could put that in the use
Usage.
for issuing a permit. So I think that would clean it up, just go with that smaller amount. It's kind of consistent on, what the lot widths, the minimums. I don't even know if that's necessary. It's not in a lot of zoning, but if we had it, it's pretty consistent at that to 66. I think we have one commercial where it's 33, but, and then it just becomes that question of lot coverage. Whether it's 50%, 60%, or 65%.
Coverage and setbacks. Aren't there setback issues?
Oh, yeah, the
in
setback,
existing in north?
that is it. Yes, I did put in here, the minimum side setbacks, I think should be, my opinion was to move them all to the 10%, to the 10 feet like it is in Water Street East.
I think I'm okay with the spirit of this too. I probably am gonna need to walk down these streets and look at each property and really make sure we're not missing something, but initial reaction, okay, let's see.
I think that's a great point. Walk Water Street, look at the east side of the street. And between the green and the light blue, and see, is there any major distinction on the buildings I'm looking at, north versus south, for instance? And if you say no, well, maybe they should be the same regulations. So,
Yeah, it's currently what you're gonna see, because I've done it, I've looked at all of them. And even any of the change we're talking about right now doesn't affect anything that's in existence. The only thing it would potentially be would be somebody in Water Street North, if they wanted to build that restaurant property, they can no longer go up to 100%. They have to limit it at that 60 or 65, and they'd have to have setbacks of 10 feet, front and rear. But yeah, everybody else should do the same walk and kind of look at it, because there really is no distinction on that side. Other than the fact that, of course, you've got some of the ones that could be, closer to a residential, type of a structure that are in there. Which you wouldn't have as much on the Water Street East, but you get a couple of those up on the Water Street North side.
Is that house on Water Street South even occupied, the single family house? It's the one next to Miles Wee or?
Yeah, no, it's the one right here next to New Holland.
Yeah,
They did have a short-term rental license,
okay.
but now there's an issue with that, so I think they're looking for a permanent renter, from what I was told.
Well, I'll just say, since I first saw the zoning map long before I was on the plan commission, I was shocked at the number of colors. I think it's great that we take 4 districts and make them into 2. For any number of reasons, including our work, the city staff work, and resident, a potential home, not a potential property buyer coming into our city and looking at it going, oh, okay, it's just cleaner, easier to understand. It makes us look less parochial or antiquated or whatever word, adjective I'm looking for.
Granular.
And the other thing I think,
Granular.
the other thing I think I really, and again, hopefully everybody had a chance to look at, but David, I will tell you that I was in agreement with all of the recommended changes you had on page 43 as far as the uses. To try to make it consistent. I looked at each one where you were taking it from, not permitted to a special or from a permitted to a not permitted. Because again, it came down to that question of why is this available on this side of the street, but it's not available on the other side of the street. And I think the big change was, like you said, the ones that went from permitted to not permitted were the marina type of ones, because they're not permitted now because they're no longer any waterfront properties in that zone. But as far as if you're moving forward, I would be in favor of everything that's laid out there on page 43 as far as the uses go.
I'm in agreement with the uses as well. Yeah.
And I think we can actually have a draft, almost like what we're doing with the signs. You can put a number in for like these dimensional, and then we can actually kind of look at those in our next meeting and kind of say, hey, start off, with the 65, but if somebody wants to make it less, then we could debate that and we can have those as some variables. But I think we could actually move forward with this consolidation.
Yeah.
And I know it will require not only us making a vote to approve it at the next meeting, if we came down to it, then it's a public hearing. And then for the public hearing, it would be. So
I'm gonna wear my helmet in that meeting.
we know there's only 2 that I haven't, and I'll talk to them up front.
Say what? Oh, okay.
So I think so we'll focus a little bit more on potential combination of Water Street East, Water Street North, and then look at City Center, and then to see if there's anything that we need to do to accommodate the unique uses south of Palmer.
And I think that, again, everybody's gonna have their, opportunity on how it finally gets drafted, but the short term, I mean, the home that's there, having it grandfathered into the city center is fine because it's already in existence. So it's not non-conforming. Although I would have to say that moving forward, I would not want it to be allowed as a single family in the city center. So I don't know if there's a way of drafting it to where it's like, hey, it's grandfathered, but if they change the use, it would it would have to meet one of the standards.
That's pretty typical anyway. If you have a non-conforming use and you change it to conforming, you can't just change it back to non-conforming at a future date. So yeah.
And that might just be making one use non-conforming in that area, and we'll take a look at that just to see if we are making anything else non-conforming, but is non-conforming is not the end of the world.
Correct.
Right. It can continue on and it can even be repaired and in
Correct.
some cases improved. It's just the long-term existence is not encouraged. So I think for this, I can really, what I kind of envision is having Water Street East, Water Street North, side by side with one column instead of the various note 1, note 2, note 3 for each, just have them side by side and then have a combined suggested column, which would be our new Water Street's potential district.
Correct.
And then, so we can see, there's a 0-foot setback here and a 10-foot setback here. So what is the side setback in our new, just so we can look at each district and make a decision. What is that new column going to look like?
Right. And if, just what I'm trying to manage from a timeline. So if we have that at our June meeting, we approve it, you could have language for us to approve in the July meeting, which then means it's an August meeting for the public hearing.
sounds about right, because the June meeting, I'll have things in table form, we'll have all the information. But then for July, it will have to be transformed into our ordinance. form.
Exactly, ordinance format.
Yep.
And that's what we would look at. And then if that's approved, we would set it for a public hearing for the August meeting. Then after the public hearing, we could vote on it and it could go to council then September.
And just to clarify as well, the land uses, we're gonna tune up each term just to make sure,
Right.
we may say general office, retail, restaurant,
Right.
just make it nice. And also we're gonna need clear definitions for each term, because not all of these are defined in the ordinance.
Right.
Every regulated land use should have a definition, so that's gonna be something else that we'll have to include in this.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be open to like your suggestions of ones that could be combined. You know, like, again, we're so granular on this whole domestic business repair, personal services, retail stores, art galleries. They're all permitted uses. You know, can it just be called, like retail, sometimes,
Exactly.
and it's permitted, it's just, we can leave them all individual, but I'm like, hey, if you're cleaning things up, do we really need? If we've got what I consider a retail business, but we're classifying it and we're breaking it down to like different types of retail, but they're always, all of them are permitted, none of them are special use, then just put them all together.
Right.
And maybe just make that retail is defined as.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. See,
Great.
it really wasn't that hard.
Somebody else did all the hard work for us.
Absolutely.
All the granular work, the word of the night.
Is there anything else on the zoning districts that we would like to comment on or question? Direction that you need from us?
Well, I think I have directions for this, I'll pull the new terms together and definitions and terms, and then I think the next step would be for us to look at either the non-focus area commercial districts or the residential districts. So we can do a similar exercise with the remaining non-focus commercial, or we can do residential if that's. I think that the non-focus commercial districts all kind of serve their own purpose. It's just, I think the focus areas are really the ones that deserve the attention and potentially the consolidation. But we're gonna also have that in residential as well, so. Would you want to do a similar exercise for residential districts, or? We had originally talked about doing both residential and commercial, but I just want to make sure that's still a priority.
My feeling was the commercial was the priority. I mean, I looked at the residential. I'm open to kind of discussing it. What I really don't want to see is have people coming in and saying, well, let's rezone what's R1 versus R2, R3, and 4 because of I can't get a short-term rental license in my neighborhood. So part of me is like, let's just leave the residential alone. But I'm open to it. Because I kind of think that some of the residential, like as we go through the master plan, if we determine that there's different parts of the city that we want to handle differently, we could also go back and address the residential zone as part of the master plan.
I would,
Mhm.
yeah, I would definitely go along with that. And I think having the master plan behind us, if we were to make any changes to the residential district, we're just gonna, it should be guided by that. So if we're updating it, we should update it. Technically, we should update it before we do all of this, but I don't think we're gonna find that much opposition.
Right now.
Makes all the sense in the world, but residential, I would leave alone until at least we get the master plan done, so.
And I think when other people look at the other commercial districts, it's pretty quick. There's a couple of ones that I noted that it's not permitted uses that we might want to consider making them permitted to kind of make it consistent as to why in the resort district can't I have a short-term rental? I'm like, well, I don't really know why if it's allowed every place else, as long as there's a license available, kind of a thing. But that could be something we can discuss.
Good.
And if there's nothing else, then we will close out the current discussion and we'll carry it forward on the commercial district rezoning. I did not have any communications in our packets was the zoning project reports, planning zoning by Luke. It was the one from April 14th. There was an interim in between because he does it for each council meeting. And then he put in the most recent one, which is the May 12th. Because I was going through it, I even asked him, I said, wait,
Yeah,
one of them was on the April one, one's not in, I can't find this properly in
Steve's
the
eagle eye.
May. And he's like, well, that one dropped off on the one in between the two.
Yeah.
So,
I'll start including both reports. So
Nice.
you'll get essentially the council reports are bi-weekly. So I've been using the most recent one for you guys, but I'll just start including both. And this one, I didn't really want 12 or 16 pages at the end of our packet of just stuff that I'm working on. It's still, publicly available. It's on the city council packet. So, but I will be including both bi-weekly reports for the future packets.
Luke, I just one question. I know there's a couple of them where the short-term rental application was denied because there are no licenses available. How those conversations go?
Pretty well. So I don't know that they went poorly.
They accepted it.
Yeah, we don't have licenses in certain districts, and that's the
That's what I
situation.
was
So
guessing.
I don't think anybody was, I'm sure some people were disappointed, but
But they kind of knew it, yeah.
we have caps. So
Yes, I just wanted to bring it up on because
it was
what I
a
heard, the people they were very much aware of it. It got denied and they weren't making an issue, which I thought was a positive.
Yeah, it was a bit of a stressful time for a couple of weeks when we made some changes regarding transfers, what was allowed and what is. But one of the things we did obviously was allow prior transfers. However, to address those, you had to submit in a certain time frame. They were time sensitive, which means that I had to address them in that similar time frame. So yeah, it was a busy week or so, but I think it went fairly well. And hopefully we have a sort of cap on short-term rentals now to where we won't be talking about it quarterly. So
Exactly.
that'd be great.
Very good. Anybody else that have any questions on his reports? If not, we'll move to our last public comment. We don't have anyone in the room. I don't see any hands online, so we will close the public comments. Commissioner comments. Start with Bob.
Obviously disappointed in terms of the tri-community master plan, but otherwise a good meeting. That went well.
Good meeting. Summer's here.
Mhm. Yay.
Joe?
Yeah, same thing. Good meeting. Appreciate all the work that's been done to help us navigate through it's a pretty complicated topic here. So thank you and looking forward to getting the master plan update going. And I do share your
Mhm.
disappointment as well. So
I have nothing additional.
I look forward to working on the master plan and that's it for tonight.
No, I think I'm happy to see some of these things continue to move forward. I look forward to getting the drafts. Remind everyone that we did kind of say we'd take a look at our master plan and Douglas's and the things that Luke's going to send out to us by June 3rd and kind of getting our initial comments back so they can have more direction for us on the June meeting. Other than that, well, I look forward to seeing everybody at the June meeting. If there's anything that comes up, we're available. I just saw the first streak of lightning, so I think we're getting out of it just in time.
motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Motion was made and seconded. All those in favor? All right. You're like, I thought you were telling me. I was like.